Hello and welcome to today's webinar presentation. As your facilitator, let me make my introductions. I'm Wendy Gill, the Mixed Farming Officer based at Forbes for the Ag Services Unit. I sit down today with Anthony Clark in this pre-recorded virtual presentation. Today we're going to focus on the Quambone region and looking at the seasonal outlook and conditions that producers can be aware of to utilise and make decisions around their farming business enterprise. This event today is brought to you as part of the Central West Local Land Services Ag Services ADAPT project. This project is supported through the funding from Australian Government and the National Landcare Program. Let me take the time to introduce our presenter today, and I give a very warm welcome to Anthony Clark. Anthony is from the Department of Primary Industries and he's worked with the department for 4 years. He is the current team leader for the Climate Applications Unit and he's based at Orange at the Orange Agricultural Institute. He has previously worked across Australia and internationally on climate, and most recently has played a major role in the Department of Primary Industries and LLS emergency fire response over the summer period this year. I welcome Anthony and I'll hand over to him now to start his presentation.
Thanks very much, Wendy. Just take a couple of seconds to set things up. I'm here today to talk about the seasonal conditions and outlook for the Quambone region. The material that we're going to cover in the presentation today, we're going to have a look at the drought status and trends, have a look at the latest seasonal outlook for the state and for your region. Most importantly, we're going to unpack some of the do's and don'ts and have a look at some guidelines if you're looking to use climate information and in particular outlooks in your on-farm decision making. So, getting right into it. It's really slow going, changing slides. Oh, there we go. First of all, just a real overview of recent seasonal conditions. What we've got on screen here are some drought indicators. In DPI, we use drought indicators as just a touch point. They're a general guide to the type of climate variability and its impacts in your region, a first touch. We tend to look at 3 drought indicators. The blue line there is rainfall. It's a rainfall index, and what that's showing is for any point in time, rainfall aggregated over a 12-month period. We've got similar indices there, the brown and the light brown lines. They're the same thing, but for soil moisture and also pasture and crop growth. And we can see from this sort of data, you know, it's no secret, you guys have been managing a fairly severe drought. We had a fairly sharp entry into that drought in 2017 after a reasonable period in 2016, 2017. A little bit of, you know, false entry into the drought, a little bit of rainfall, and then you know, a real intensification and a prolonged event. I guess the really good sign is that in about February, March this year, as you guys know full well, we have started getting some decent rainfall, and we're in that awkward period, if you like, of it's one of the most difficult things to work out about drought is, are we genuinely coming out of drought? You know, what's the transition like? How strong is the transition? How sustained is the transition? All these sorts of practical questions which people on farms in your region are grappling with, and that's the guts, I guess, the important bit of information that we're going to look at. What are our expectations going forward? terms of the drought indicators, you can see, you know, a really rapid increase in rainfall. It's been quite wet. We're hearing field reports of some people not being able to get on paddocks, you know, during this period. We're starting to see, you know, a real build up in terms of soil moisture and crop growth. So, yeah, been through a drought, really positive signs going forward. Probably some of the best seasonal conditions we've seen, you know, for a couple of years in your region. Like I mentioned, it's really important not to just look at indicators like that and appreciate how these indicators that give a regional view, how that actually plays out on the ground. One of the techniques we use is, these days, we look at quite high resolution remote sensing. This particular remote sensing index I have up there at the moment is a plant health index. Really tells us how green the landscape is. This particular example was from back in January, pre the rainfall event. And you guys have lived through this, you know, on the ground. We really start to see the bare bones of the landscape. Low levels of pasture cover, no crops, you know, real stress on water resources. The next image is actually from a couple of days ago, the 13th of May. And, you know, great news for everyone. You know, we're just seeing a really good response. We had an early break in about March. We're seeing, you know, generally speaking, you know, quite strong pasture growth rates, real positive signs that we're finally coming out of this drought event. Quite importantly, you can see in this particular image, yeah, there's a lot of variability. You can see some bare paddocks probably being prepared for a winter crop. No signs of germination or sowing in those paddocks. You can see a few paddocks around with quite variable and patchy response. So even though we can say, yeah, generally across the region we're seeing better, it's certainly not uniform. There's quite a lot of paddock to paddock and farm to farm variability that relates to soil type, you know, how deep the impact went during the drought, how quickly the landscape can respond. You know, that's fairly typical. And like I said, it's actually a really difficult time. It's a debatable issue. Are you in drought? Are you out of drought? And it's during this transition, you know, that some people call the recovery period, where there's quite a bit of uncertainty, a lot of variation, a lot of questions about, will this be sustained? Is it short-lived? Is it going to be a false break? I guess it's really important to understand what's going on climatologically. What are the drivers? And everyone's hears about these processes. You know, the classic one that everyone hears about is the El Nino Southern Oscillation. It refers to sea surface temperatures out in the Pacific, off the you know, off to the far west of the Pacific Basin, really. And what that actually influences is generally the amount of moisture in the atmosphere that's falling over eastern and southeastern Australia. Certainly probably the most dominant climate driver. In recent times, people would have started hearing about the Indian Ocean dipole. It again is come to prominence over the last, I guess, sort of 10, 15 years or so. There's been a lot more research done on it, a lot more studies done on it. And again, really at one level, you could think about our climate as a big interplay between the Indian Ocean dipole and the El Nino Southern Oscillation. It's like this tug of war that governs the amount of soil moisture and of atmospheric moisture and its origins. But there are other climate processes which are important as well. One is the behaviour of the tropics. You know, what we call the annual tropical system. technically, you may have heard these words. Technically, it's called the Madden-Julian oscillation. It's really about the pattern and latitude of the tropical belt, and it's the timing of it, the onset of the monsoon, and so forth. What triggers that? That does have an important, is another driver. The other one, which you may have heard about, is a process called the southern annular mode. It's really the pressure systems revolving around the Antarctic. And a really important bit of information about those is where they're positioned latitudinally up and down. Are they closer to Australia? Are they coming up into the Tasman, or are they really tightly hugging Antarctica? SAM, the southern annular mode, quite volatile. There's not a lot of persistence in it. It can change quite rapidly. It's really hard to anticipate what it's going to do. But all these processes interact to give us, our forecast essentially. What really happened, late last year and into March, is that couple of things. We had a very strong Indian Ocean dipole event that was really influencing and driving our drought. We had a very weak, almost non-existent ENSO. It wasn't really a factor, and that really brought into play this Indian Ocean dipole event. In about spring last year, we actually started to detect a lot of atmospheric warming over Antarctica. We had this sort of unusual, quite rare stratospheric warming. And it actually, for Australia and for our part of the world, basically leads to increasing dryness. It basically means those southerly systems, that SAM process, is really constrained to belts just north of Antarctica. So in New Zealand, they get wet conditions. In Australia, it means we get unseasonably dry conditions. It was actually the combination of the IOD and that process that led to this much more prolonged drought that we had, this kind of double dip drought that you saw in your time series data. Those two processes broke down, and there's actually a lot of the major climate drivers were inactive around that February, March, April period this year, and it's led to local synoptic patterns really driving the outcomes on the ground. And a good example was in March, Tropical Cyclone Esther. It basically broke up and drifted down, and it was really the event that drove that early autumn break. And we've got quite warm local sea surface temperatures, and that's allowing systems to form and bring, I guess, the follow-up rain that we've had and the good seasonal conditions. If you want to find out more information or get a bit more background about the main climate drivers, it's worth your while. A really good place to start is it's actually a series of animations and explanations called Climate Dogs. I've put the website up there if you've got time to write it down, or otherwise just do a search in your web browser for DPI Climate Dogs, and it'll take you to some really nice material that you can use to start learning more about the main climate drivers that affect our climate. So climate scientists in Australia and around the world every month bring together a seasonal outlook. We're actually quite spoilt in the Southern Hemisphere. We're one of the few regions that has this regular 3-month outlook. A lot of scientific work studying those climate drivers, trying to reconcile the main influences to try and give farmers and other people a prognosis going forward. What I've put up here is a seasonal outlook that was issued in late April. What it actually is the outlook probabilities from the Bureau of Meteorology's main climate model. We'll dig into that in a little bit in a little while. The way that the Bureau issues its official climate forecast at this level is they actually go and calculate the chance of exceeding the median rainfall. Now, at this point, I usually ask the audience, do you know your median rainfall? And it's quite surprising at times that people don't. And sometimes people, many people understand what a median is, some people don't. So I thought I'd just explain what the median is. If you take all of your rainfalls for the next 3 months that have happened in history, the median's the middle point. 50% of your observations have been wetter, 50% of your observations have been drier. So what these forecasts do, they're basically saying the probability of the rainfall total over the next 3 months is a probability of being above the median. What we've got at the moment are probably the most optimistic climate forecasts that we've seen for some time for New South Wales, probably at least the last couple of years. Quite strong probabilities in your region of being above the median rainfall over the coming 3 months. This particular model output, this particular forecast, a little bit old by a couple of weeks. The latest one, which we'll have a look at later, is actually a little bit stronger. It's become more optimistic. So quite good news, quite encouraging news on the climate front. It's really important to understand probabilistic forecasts, these concepts, in order to be able to use it in decision making. The little analogy that I like to use, it is a little bit like gambling. You are playing, in this case, roulette. And if you look at a roulette wheel, we're looking at rolling it, and we're looking at putting the dice in it or the ball in it and working out, is it going to be red or black? And the forecast, that probability, that chance, really tells you how many red or black quadrants are on the roulette wheel. If we've got a 50-50 chance, as we have on the right, there's an even number, the same number of black and red quadrants on the roulette wheel. If you go over to the right, some clever forecaster, i.e. me, has taken a texture and I've coloured in a few extra ones black. And really that's what the forecast is telling you. There's a slightly greater chance. The really important thing that we all have to understand, we still spin the wheel. Even though that there's an increased chance of being wetter than median conditions at the moment, we still could land on the red. So it is more about weighting, it's more about risk, it's more about chance. There's a lot of work and a lot of consternation about, well, really what I'd like is certainty. And my advice to you is forecasters that pretend they're giving you certainty or really, really high certainty around climate, I'd just take that with a slight grain of salt. Really, you need to get on to their probabilities. Well, what does that mean for my decision? If you're interested in accessing more information about the Bureau's forecasts, some really good resources on the web. If you jump on the Bureau's website and search up rainfall outlook, it'll take you to this web page that I've put up. I've also got the web address down there. Really, you can have a look on the search bar, and as I've done, entered the location that you're at, Quambone, and it actually comes up with that little dialog box, give you your median rainfall for the next quarter, which is 86 millimeters. Will tell you that overall forecast probability, It'll also break it down a little bit more for you and look at the chance of getting aggregate rainfall over 3 months in those bins, 15 mils, 50 mils, 150 mils. And obviously we always see increasing chance or decreasing chance of higher rainfall always. It's really the shape of that curve that you're looking at. It's quite a reasonable set of odds that you're going to get, above median, 86 mil and above. More than half the observations are in those categories. But that's just a really, if you want a bit more detail about the forecast, that's a really nice tool to jump in on and use. All free, all available and kept up to date. The second bit of information that's really important when interpreting forecasts is, how accurate are they? Technically, they call this skill scoring. It's a good idea to start building a bit of an idea of what the skill scores mean, what accuracy means, and how reliable the forecasts are. They, you can see there at the bottom of the page, they publicize the forecasts. What a lot of people don't understand is that the skill, the ability, actually varies seasonally. Typically in Australia, the forecasts are quite low in skill during the February-March period and into autumn. They really start to pick up right about now, this time of the year. This is just a feature of our climate. Some people call it the autumn predictability hump, the Southern Hemisphere predictability hump. Basically, the climate system usually goes through a big reset due to its orbital forcing. It's just that point in the year where the hemispheres start to tip and the seasons change. So particularly in the Pacific Ocean, it can be quite volatile, highly unpredictable during that autumn period. We tend to get a lot more certainty around the persistence of the El Nino process in particular from about now on. So it's starting to look quite good, quite optimistic. We're starting to build a little bit of skill in the forecasts, starting to see higher probabilities of wetter than median. And what's actually happening is we're starting to see the Indian Ocean at the moment start to lean towards a much more sort of optimistic setting for us. El Nino at the moment, there's still a bit of uncertainty. The longer term models are actually starting to project a La Nina. I think we need to wait another month and look at the observations that are coming in and the more certain model runs that they're going to do over the next month to really have a more certain take on that ENSO process. But yeah, quite an optimistic forecast. Same website, down on the dialog box there. If you actually want to have a look at past accuracy scores, you can. You click on that. Quambone's the dot there. You can see again, these are quite high skill levels, 55, 65, 75%. It means that it's picking that above median or below median, that binary probability, generally 6.5, 7.5 times out of 10. But like I said before, bear in mind that skill score changes over the year. It's good to keep updated with it. Now, in terms of use of forecasting, there have actually been studies done, what accuracy levels make it really useful. And for many producers, maybe farmers further to the south, and to some extent, you guys in your region, picking autumn's pretty important. Unfortunately, we do have, like I mentioned, low skill scores during autumn and it picks up in winter. So there's issues about, is the skill highly valuable at the right time for our farming systems? And you've got to factor that in, and people do. Each farming system, as we move around the states, got quite different decision points and critical windows where they're making stocking rate decisions or decisions to sow crops. So it really comes down to you and your advisors and your agronomists with that local knowledge to delve into this information and understand this interaction between skill scoring and is it useful. And certainly I would advocate if you've got high skill and it's a forecast in a critical window, think about how you're weighting your decisions, your cropping program and so forth. So I might just jump a bit because we get asked quite a lot about official weather forecasts. We've done a lot of public talks with farmer groups during the course of this drought, and there's been a lot of questions back to us in DPI around, I guess, a little bit of, frustration about the climate forecast. Or about the weather forecast. So here, we're not so much looking at the 3-month period, which we've just seen, the seasonal outlook. We're looking at the ability of the Bureau's, in this case, models, and they are actually different models and different systems, ability to predict day-to-day weather, over the next week. And again, there's a really, you hear this being reported on the radio. You hear radio people communicating the forecast, the news, etc. They're generally, most of them, getting their information from the Bureau of Meteorology. You can jump online and use this tool called METI to get a more detailed view of the forecast if you wish. The Bureau, and we'll go through this in a little while, the Bureau actually also source other apps, push their information out through other apps, and we'll go through a little bit of that in a minute. But what I've done here is I've gone into METI, I've found Quambone, had a look at the forecast for this week, and generally speaking, not much rain being forecast. If we look at the rainfall in that table, 0%, 0 millimeters forecast. Quite warm, sunny conditions. Probably, if we've got a bit of moisture in the ground, they're quite nice growth conditions. I'm just flicking to the next slide here. It's sort of half gone to sleep. We'll wait for it to come through. Oh, here we go. What we've been finding working with people over the last few years is when we do have an active rain forecast, there's been a little bit of misinterpretation going on, and it's largely a little bit about the way this information's packaged on websites and communicated. So what I've got here is actually an older forecast for Quambone in March, where we have had a little bit of rain forecast. So we're looking here at this box, Thursday, the 19th of March. And what they do is they give you a possible rainfall range of 4 to 10 millimeters, and the chance of the rainfall is 60%. What we've found is some people interpret that as, great, they're optimistic people. I've got a 60% chance of getting 10 mils. And in cases where that top range is, say, 50 mils, people go, wow, yeah, strong chance of sowing rainfall, strong chance of rainfall that's going to get production on track, or really make a big decision in their agronomy or their cropping rotation. And we've seen people get that wrong and get very frustrated. So really what these figures tell us, the first figure there, the bottom range, 4 mils, is actually the 50% chance. There's a 50% chance, 1 in 2 chance you're going to get 4 mils. When you get out to that top figure, that 10 mils in this particular forecast, it's a much lower chance, it's 25. So the thing you've got to really look at, I think, is that bottom figure. That gives you the more certain level. The probability there is actually just the chance of will I get any rain at all or not. There's a 60% chance that you'll get some rainfall, and that is just 0.2 of a millimeters and above. So the correct interpretations are, I have a 60% chance of receiving rain greater than 2 millimeters. I've got a 1 in 2 chance of that rain being light, i.e. 4 millimeters, and I've got a 1 in 4 chance of it being light again or a little bit heavier, 10 mils. So this is really forecasting a bit of drizzle. Really important to go through that and unpack that and understand that's what these figures on the websites and the apps actually mean. It's been a bit slow again. I think one of the other things that pieces of feedback we get from our talks with farmers is questions about where different weather information is coming from. And what's happened over the last 10, 15 years, weather information is actually the most shared information and data around the world. Everyone's naturally interested in knowing what the weather's going to be like for their purposes, being our purpose is agricultural production and risk. Other people, it's, do I play footy on the weekend and so on. We've just seen this explosion in apps. We've all got smartphones, or a lot of us have, and it's just getting easier and easier to get weather information. And we've actually lost a little bit of knowledge about where that actually comes from. And there's a huge diversity in quality. Some of you might be using, say, a website or an app from WeatherZone. That's actually the source of that information is America. It's actually the American models from NOAA and NCEP or NASA, if you like. If you're using something like Willy Wind or Predict Wind and a few others, it's actually model output coming from Europe. So what actually happens is that the app provider, the front end party, pays for a subscription through a piece of technology called an application protocol interface. It's a way the different weather bureaus around the world are monetizing, funding some of their modeling and computing and etc. So getting a bit of a kickback. And obviously, if you want better information, you've got to pay more for your subscription. And different websites and services, etc., have different cost models. They really quite often push out free weather information and pay for it, but they've worked out the extra bump they get in their subscription is worth that payment. In terms of the European model sources, very few people in Australia are actually paying for the top quality European weather forecasting services. It's usually the lower end stuff or the free stuff that's pushed out. Similarly for the NOAA NCEP stuff. Of course, we've got our own weather modeling. These are the Bureau of Meteorology's, they're called the Access models. The actual source code for the models is a collaborative project between us and the United Kingdom Weather Bureau. A lot of customization. A lot of people ask which one do I use. I tend to go to the Bureau of Meteorology, largely because I'm really familiar with the science. I have a lot of confidence in it. I know that they do quite a bit of work around verifying the model and really trying to set it up a bit more. Do they get it right all the time? No, they don't. None of these models are going to get it right all the time. My advice to people, out of these main global sources of forecasting, the main thing is that you look at one or maybe two and you stick with it. Don't try and jump between forecasting providers and say, yeah, this week the Americans were better and last week they weren't, and try and pick a winner that way. It's a probability. We've got to learn how to use probabilities in decisions and stick with it. And yeah, they are going to get it wrong sometimes. So I'm just going to finish up there. There's quite a lot of information. And I'd like to finish off just with a bit of a recap and break it down in a few do's and don'ts. You know, when you're looking at using outlooks or weather forecasting to make your decisions. You know, so do know your farm's median rainfall if you're going to use the seasonal outlook. It's just a important piece of information to help you bring the outlook back down to the ground for your farm. Know what skill means, know about accuracy, and have a look at what its skill is in the forecast period going forward. It's all there on that website if you want to tap into it. Develop a bit of an appreciation of where the information is coming from. You know, is it coming from one of the main global sources of forecasting? Is it getting reinterpreted? Is it the free stuff? Is it the good stuff? Are you paying for it? You know, are you paying a subscription and they're guaranteeing that it's high quality information? You know, particularly if you're going to make real decisions with this stuff. Apply that sort of mature lens to it. You know, be certain of where your information is coming from if it's important. Really important with both weather and the outlooks. You know, you always got to roll the wheel. It's probabilistic. Always ask yourself when you get the forecast, say, how many times in 10 is it saying this is going to happen? And it'll lead to a much better use of forecasting in your day-to-day decision making. Do your homework with the interpretation of figures on websites and apps. I've taken you through a case study there, in this case with the bureaus. There are others as well, but know what the figures mean and know how to interpret them properly if you're going to use them in decisions. Understand the flexibility in your farming systems. It's not always about the forecast. Sometimes it's our ability of our systems and our strategies to respond to the forecasts. That's a fairly broad statement. The reason it's broad is when it gets to the nitty gritty, almost every farm's different. Every farm's got a different business strategy. Their rotations are different. They're trying different things. But it's really important if you're going to use forecasts to understand how much flexibility you've got in your framework, in your decision, and know how to apply a forecast to that particular decision. Yeah, and understand the differences between weather and climate. Sometimes we find people get a bit confused. Understand that the weather prediction systems are quite different to the climate prediction systems. Understand that the climate outlooks are really about the very big systems, longer periods of time, whereas the weather outlooks are about much smaller systems, what's happening locally. A couple of don'ts. Really do not try and make black or white and make or break decisions with any climate forecast. They're probabilistic. If you find that you're trying to rely on the Bureau or the Americans or whomever to go, it will deliver me 10 mils or 50 mils, we really need to unpack and rethink the decision. Yeah, and don't expect, farm level accuracy from these regional forecasts. Both the weather and the seasonal outlooks work really big across big lumps of the state and the whole state. Once you start going down into, does it really work highly accurately for my individual block of land? The skill actually does start to fall away. But know how to think about it regionally, know how to factor that type of uncertainty in. I'm going to finish there. Look, again, thank you for your time. Sorry there's been a few kerfuffles with the technology. I would love to be out there talking to you guys face to face. Really enjoy that, and was really disappointed we couldn't get out, but let's make do with what we've got. If you do have any questions or want some follow-up, my email address is there. Don't hesitate to get in touch. Happy to have a chat if you have any further questions. So I might finish there today and hand back over to Wendy. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anthony. That's a fantastic presentation. I'm really actually very happy that you also shared with us your app preferences in terms of what you use in your daily operating of which forecasting suite you actually go to, and where you find your confidence in pulling from your information databases, where you're actually pulling your preferences of using different apps. So that was really useful, and even having those pointing out those particular resources, whether it's been on the Bureau of Meteorology's website, the key features around that, or even those simple, those simple videos with the climate dogs options of going and learning a bit more about weather forecasting and seasonal outlooks, and in an animated video concept resource is really worthwhile, and I would encourage all our producers in the Central West to go and have a look at those resources, particularly to make sure that you are all grasping some of those fundamental concepts around determining and unpacking some of the seasonal outlook and forecasting data that you're using. I suppose the most encouraging sign and take-home message I have from your presentation, Anthony, it's lovely to see from March, when we started these seasonal outlooks, the change from looking at NVI data sheets there, graphs, and seeing the changes in pasture growth and the responsiveness of different land types to the change in season that we've experienced across the Central West, and particularly focusing today around that Quambone region. So that's been a really positive aspect and really visually highlighted in your presentation today. So I thank you very much for that. As Anthony said, if our listeners today would like to get in contact with Anthony, his details are again on my screen, and feel free to touch base with him about any further questions as well. As Anthony indicated, we'd certainly have loved to have been delivering his presentation and some of the other presentations we have planned for you in a face-to-face format, but certainly we're all keen to try these new technologies in the virtual space and link in and engage with our producers across the region in as many opportunities as we can. So if you'd also like more details about the ADAPT project, which this program has been funded through, our ADAPT program manager is Pip Doolan, and her contact details are also listed below Anthony's as well. So we have a number of different events that will be rolled out across our region that relate not only to climate and seasonal outlook and forecast, but we have other key focus areas around cropping, pasture, business management, just to name a few. So certainly, if anybody would like to know further information about events that are coming up, please feel free to contact Pip, or certainly all events are posted on the ADAPT website page at the Central West Local Land Services website, and any of the Ag Services team would be happy to receive any questions about that. So that brings us to the end of today's discussions and ADAPT project presentation. So I'd really like to thank our audience listeners for tuning in, and hope that they've found it really useful and been able to pick up some take-home messages from Anthony's presentation. I know I certainly did. For those who are actually engaging with us online in an online format, there will directly follow this presentation a quick 5-minute survey, just to give both myself and Anthony some feedback about some of your key learnings from the presentation. And I certainly know we all value highly our producers' feedback, so I'd encourage all listeners to jump on and engage in that survey. It should take less than 5 minutes with a cup of coffee. So thanks again to Anthony, and I certainly look forward to being your host at the next Ag Services webinar presentation. But that's all we've got today, and I thank you for your time. So until a further presentation, I'll bid you all to have a good day. Thank you very much.